Hi, Joan.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
I'm just fine, thank you.
I should tell people who we are, I guess. I'm Robert Wright, and you are Joan Roughgarden at Stanford University. Is that right?
That's correct.
You're a biologist.
Uh-huh. In the Department of
And
Biological
you've written some
Science.
books, right?
Yes, indeed, I have.
Evolution's Rainbow is the name of one, and the Genial gene,
Yes,
which I guess stands in contrast to the selfish gene, would be another one.
Uh-huh, that's my most recent book. That's been out now for about 2 weeks.
Oh, so you're still in the maelstrom of public attention, right?
Well, I think it has yet to start. There's some public attention.
Huh.
Its formal publication date is April 20th, and this is a little bit before that. And so
Oh, I see. Yeah. So you're still in the period that authors refer to as the calm before the calm.
Right.
Okay. Well, anyway, congratulations. It's great to have a book out. So you and I were both asked to write essays, asked by the Templeton Foundation to write essays on the question of does evolution explain human nature? And I, in a somewhat brash moment, said yes, and then elaborated with a few qualifications. But you said, what did you say? You said not entirely and maybe not ever, or not yet and almost surely never was your answer, right?
That's correct.
And so I guess we have something to disagree about.
Well, perhaps we, I think, share the same optimism about the long-term predictive power of evolutionary biology for human nature, but we might disagree on our assessment of how far evolutionary biology has come.
Mm-hmm. Now, maybe actually a way to lead into it is actually to refer to your book, your recently published book, because I noticed in your essay you said that your research suggests that the selfish gene metaphor for evolution is misleading and inaccurate. Now, that, of course, refers to that's a term popularized by Richard Dawkins in the title of his famous book from about 34 years ago.
That's right.
Or 33. And you take issue with that whole kind of terminology to describe the influence of genes in our lives?
Yes, I do. And I should emphasize that my book is not an attack on Richard Dawkins, whom I personally like quite a bit. But and I taught from the selfish gene back in the early 70s when it came out, and that does represent, I think, accurately and effectively our thinking at that time. And Richard was, I think, very effective in conveying the criticisms that had been in the wind, particularly from G.C. Williams about what's now called naive group selection. And so it was.
Maybe we should just pause and say that the general idea with group selection is that natural selection does favor traits that are, quote, good for the group, not just good for the individual and not really just kind of good for your close kin so much, but good for the larger group. We should get, that's an inadequate definition, but that's the basic idea of group selection, right?
That's right. And so typically at that time one could hear nature shows where, and just see them on television, where the behavior of different animals would be explained by reference to how the group was better off because of that behavior. And G.C. Williams and Richard Dawkins and others at that time, but especially Richard, were effective in showing that idea just didn't make sense in terms of how we understood natural selection at the time, and that the natural selection boils down to how individuals are able to leave more offspring into the next generation. And it's not about how groups leave progeny, but it's how individuals leave progeny. And at that time, in the early 70s, it wasn't even, the idea of group selection wasn't even plausible when you thought about it hard. There weren't any mathematical models for how it could work, and there weren't any empirical demonstrations of it that were convincing. All there were a lot of stories at that time. And so by introducing the phrase, the selfish gene, Dawkins and also a lot of the writing that he did at that time, he really brought home the importance of thinking about individuals and individuals' reproductive success as contrasted with the group's reproductive success in understanding how evolution works. And that really is a major contribution in publicizing and popularizing, if you will, the insights from the neo-Darwinists, who were the people who introduced genes into Darwin's original work. And those neo-Darwinists were the mathematical geneticists J.B.S. Haldane, Ronald Fisher, and Sewell Wright.
And back in the 30s and 1930s and 40s. And
right,
so on.
And it really revolutionized evolutionary biology and put it on a firm genetic basis for the first time. And excuse me, and so the work that Richard Dawkins did at that time was very effective in projecting the findings from those workers. But of course, it's different now. This is 2009, and we're in a position to inquire whether that whole metaphor of the selfish gene is accurate to what we now know about animal behavior.
Can I interrupt you to dispel one popular misconception about what the term meant, just because I think people tend to labor under it? The idea wasn't that our genes make us selfish. Indeed, a lot of the book, The Selfish Gene, was about how if you view genes as being selected by what you might call selfish criteria. In other words, if you say, look, the only question is your gene good at getting itself replicated, then it turns out that genes favoring altruism can, in some circumstances, be favored. Certainly altruism toward kin in a fairly straightforward sense. And then further, via the theory of reciprocal altruism that was developed by George Williams and Robert Trivers. Altruism of a more conditional sort, perhaps, but altruism toward people you're not related to. So the selfish gene was never a view of human nature that emphasized selfishness in any kind of real crass, crude sense, even though it might when you trace the logic out, it often means we're being a little more subtly selfish than we pretend to be sometimes. But still, the point was you can, in principle, without reference to group selection, explain really some seemingly selfless behaviors, right? So, sorry to interrupt, and if you disagree with that, let me know.
Yeah, I think that goes a bit too far, if I might say.
Oh, okay, actually, well, good. Then correct me.
Well, I wouldn't. It's not as though I would correct you, but the issue is that although Dawkins at the time did emphasize group selection and reciprocal altruism as ways to reconcile the appearance of seemingly altruistic traits, and as one proponent once said, the purpose of altruism theory is to take the altruism out of altruism and to reduce it in some sense to individual strategies.
But not necessarily conscious strategy, and I think that's
well,
the
not
key.
Conscious, but it when you said that Dawkins didn't imply that individuals were selfish or that behavior was selfish, a lot of his later writing though does take that tone, and certainly more than Dawkins himself, more recent writers have made a large deal out of sexual conflict and narratives of conflict among animals, and it's been really the extension of the selfish gene metaphor more than the extension, more than the statement of it as in the selfish gene. That's problematic, and biologists today, as you probably know, are of course claiming that sexual conflict underlies all male-female relationships, and so narratives of that sort really focus on competitive and selfish behavior to an extent that might not have been anticipated in the lovely writing of Richard from the early 70s. But he's contributed to that to some extent in his later work.
I guess. I guess one thing I'd say, at least as the stuff was originally laid out, I'd say that with kin-selected altruism, which is part of kind of selfish gene theory, and it was developed by William Hamilton and so on, that's like my altruism toward a brother or a sister or an offspring or whatever. That can be true, pure altruism at the individual level. In other words, I'll go into a burning building at great risk to myself to save them or my kids. So that I would say that which is part of the original selfish gene paradigm is true, pure altruism at the individual level, not at the genetic level, and that's the point. It's selfish from the gene's point of view.
That's a bit strong because it isn't. You see, there's a slight ambiguity that's going on here, is that a gene that's successful in the sense that increases in its gene frequency in the next generation doesn't mean that it has to be understood as a, quote, selfish gene.
Well, it certainly doesn't think of itself that way or think at all, but I mean, its behavior, the behavior it induces is conducive to its own replication.
Well, may I
Sure.
continue on that? Because, for example, if a gene increases in frequency from one generation to the next, and it's not due to genetic drift, you would like to ask, in principle, why? Is it because the gene helped other genes or worked in cooperation or coordination with other genes, or is it because the gene outcompeted some other gene? So why did the genes that didn't increase in the next generation fail to do so? Is it because they failed to be selfish, or is it because they failed to cooperate in some sense with other genes? And if you synonymize simply successful increase into the next generation with selfishness, then that forecloses or preempts the possibility of even asking about the role of cooperation, particularly including cooperation among genes, although that hasn't been my focus. I've been focusing on cooperation among individuals. But there's a slight, there's a decided loss of explanatory potential in equating selfishness with success, with successful increase in numbers or in percentages into the next generation.
Well, okay, then maybe it was an unfortunate term to use, but I certainly don't think that as he used it, at all meant to preclude the possibility that the, quote, selfishness of the gene would translate into cooperation, and in fact reciprocal altruism is kind of an example. I think you're saying that he was to some extent misunderstood. Well, maybe you're not. I would say that the term is being misunderstood if people think it precludes cooperation. But anyway, that's...
Well, it is. You might say, yes, it's being misunderstood, but there hasn't been a systematic attempt by him or others to correct that. And furthermore, the whole emphasis on cooperation or on conflict and selfishness leading to conflict, selfishness enabling conflict and implying conflict is the trend of contemporary thinking in behavioral ecology. And this is clearly mistaken. But I need to get back to the issue of whether even kin selection and reciprocal altruism are sufficient in light of what we know today. And they're not. And I used to teach kin selection, for example, when I would talk about social insects, and I would teach that in class as though it were gospel, which we sort of thought it was in the 70s. And the idea there is, of course, that the offspring that is the workers of the queen, the offspring of the queen, leave more of their own genes in the next generation by helping the queen raise more daughters than by bothering, so to speak, to raise any young of their own. And that all makes perfect sense. And I remember showing beautiful examples of this kind of thing for the Polistes wasps, which are the paper wasps, in which there clearly is one queen and two or three generations of her workers that join her at the nest and help her raise young. And that's fine. But then it turns out that there are a great many nests of ants, especially, in which there are multiple queens, and then the queens themselves are mated with multiple drones. And so this whole network of relationships that's supposed to underlie and explain the altruism isn't adequate. It just isn't there. And the logic is fine, but the question is whether it's true. And so this has led to a lot of discourse, especially among social insect folks, about the limitations of kin selection theory, even for the group that Hamilton originally proposed it for. And this is really the beginning of the re-examination of the adequacy, not the incorrectness, but just simply the adequacy of kin selection and reciprocal altruism. There are other, review volumes even of cooperation in animals. There's a whole Dallam conference about this that concluded that reciprocal altruism was extremely hard to find. There's one, I think, pretty convincing case involving blood sharing, of all things, with vampire bats, but it's really hard to find cases of it. And yet there is a great deal of cooperation taking place and a great deal of animal friendships taking place when animals, and a lot of physical intimacy among animals. And all of this has called out for, I think, going beyond the concepts and the ideas that we had in the 1970s. And I'm
so meaning moving toward some form of group selection in some cases?
No, introducing still an additional principle altogether. And the principle that I've personally been trying to introduce and working on models for involves the notion of teamwork. And you could think of it as halfway between individual selection and group selection. And what happens is that the animals, by working in a team and collaborating in a team, acquire individual fitness, but they acquire it through working in a team. And you can think really of an athletic team, for example, like basketball players. And you don't go home with a salary unless you win, but you have to cooperate to win, and it's through the cooperation that you can bring home your pay and raise your own family as an individual with your mate. And the whole notion of cooperative teamwork straddles, if you will, the gap between individual selection and group selection, and it's not reducible to either group selection or individual selection. And I've introduced modeling for how to do this, and it's interesting modeling, I think, from a theoretician's point of view, because it combines what amounts to developmental biology or social psychology at the lower level. It's a two-tier setup. And at the higher level, it uses traditional population genetics defined at the individual level. So instead of just assuming that animals start out with a phenotype that's determined by their genes, what happens is that animals acquire a phenotype by interacting with other animals. Nonetheless, the phenotype they wind up with from those interactions is what enables their genes to spread into the next generation. So you get... yeah.
I kind of suspect that some group selectionists would claim that's a form of group selection. I know David Sloan Wilson is pretty expansive in his definition of group selection. And perhaps some individual selectionists would say, well, that's individual selection. That's just reciprocal altruism with more than, two people or something. I don't know. But I guess my question is this. If your position in that essay that we alluded to earlier was that evolution can't explain or does not yet explain human nature and almost surely never will, well, it's a two-part question. I mean, one is to say that if your scenario, any part of human nature explained by the scenario you're laying out would still be a part of human nature explained by evolution. So,
yes.
So that
yes, right.
And secondly, I guess if you think almost surely evolution will never explain human nature, what kind of basic part of human nature do you think will never be explained by evolution and can certainly not be explained by it now?
Well, as I mentioned in my essay, I'm not persuaded that we're going to explain everything about any species, because it takes a lot of work to explain the evolution of a trait. Look at how much work it's taken to explain the evolution of bipedal walking in humans, and all sorts of characteristics. When you really get to work on it, it's very hard to explain that there's certain classic traits like the speckled colors on moths in England that I'm sure you've read about many times, called industrial melanism, and it took ages of efforts of work for people to understand the selective force behind just simply why animals evolve, why these butterflies, why these moths evolve speckled colors or evolve black colors in the case where there was smoke on the trees. And then we say, well, how are we going to understand the evolution of consciousness or the evolution of our moral sense? And we might be able to tell a story about the evolution of our moral tendencies, and it might be a story that's plausible relative to the current state of the knowledge. But to say that we've shown it is quite another matter. And I don't think we're going to get around to showing how evolution has caused the or how natural selection has caused the evolution of very much human behavior at all. And we just don't have the time, and we don't have the resources to do that. We don't have the time and resources to do that for other species either. And there will always be these mysteries. But even in order to get farther, we need to improve the technical machinery that we have. And we need to be aware of the inadequacy of the concepts that we've inherited from the 70s. And we need to be open to the fact that they need significant revision. And I've talked about the need to develop an account of teamwork that lies between individual selection and group selection. And I agree with you that a hardcore individual selectionist would deny that there was anything new there, and a hardcore group selectionist would also try to deny that there's anything new there. But there is something new there, and it invites and requires new modeling, new mathematical representations of how these processes work. And we need to do that if we're going to get ahead, even to the limited extent that we might be able to on understanding human social behavior, including morality and other traits like that.
Okay, well, I guess I'd say, one thing I'd say is, of course, the standards of evidence in evolutionary biology generally, are a little bit of a problem. I mean, in the sense that, physicists can run controlled experiments and show things, so compellingly that the word prove almost fits, although I think it, in a certain sense, never does in science. But with evolution, as you know, we can't, with most species, it's one thing to fool around with fruit flies and bacteria, but in general, we can't rerun evolution and show for sure that things would have been different for some species in a different environment. And also, there's kind of two different senses in which you can, when you talk about finding an evolutionary explanation for say, human morality, you could, on the one hand, just say, well, I feel confident that it serves this certain evolutionary, or it serves this particular Darwinian purpose. That is to say, this moral instinct, got genes into the generation, in the next generation for such and such reason. It's another thing to be able to actually paint a detailed scenario showing exactly, the step-by-step process by which a complex adaptation emerged. That's often very hard. So I guess when I talk about what we can explain in terms of evolution, I kind of discount for all of this. In other words, I just think the standards of evidence have to be a little lower than they are in physics. And I guess, in that light, maybe a question for you is this: is there any part of human nature that, from an evolutionary point of view, you find fundamentally puzzling? I mean, it's like, are you saying that about our moral sense, you just can't imagine how it got off the ground, or you can't imagine what function it serves, or are you just saying it's really hard to nail down empirically in a completely compelling way. Because I have, like a lot of people, some stories about how our moral sense, what role it plays, and I think they're actually reasonably compelling stories in some cases. Are you just saying, well, reasonably compelling isn't enough, or are you saying, no, you really don't kind of get it? You really don't see where our moral sense could come from via natural selection?
Well, first of all, I don't agree that we should relax our standards of rigor and of evidence for evolutionary biology. Evolutionary biology is and can be as tough a science as any other part of science. And it's not a social science, it's a science. And it can be tested. And the propositions in evolutionary biology are subject to test. For many years, I've had a joint appointment in the geophysics department because of the work that I've done in oceanography. And you can't do experiments with a global atmosphere, and you might consider global change to be an uncontrolled one. You can't do experiments by rerouting the Gulf Stream to test the effects of ocean circulation on climate. And for big systems, you can't do that. And it's a caricature of physics to suppose that they can even use experiments. It's only certain kinds of particle physics and elementary mechanics in which you can do experiments, which in some sense are conclusive. But by and large, most of the physical sciences are no more conclusive than evolutionary biology is capable of being. And claims about how human behavioral traits have evolved should be subject to test. They shouldn't just be stories that are not pitted against alternative stories that paint fundamentally different scenarios and offer fundamentally different accounts of how evolution has transpired.
But do you agree that some claims are really, really hard to test? Like we can't yet figure out a way to test them yet? Some claims about the evolution of human nature, for example?
Well, I would say that those claims are no harder to test than comparably difficult claims in the physical sciences. As I say, it's very hard to actually predict or to test a theory of why the Ice Ages formed, and it is certainly impossible at this time to develop a model that would predict the fate and also reconstruct the fate of continental drift, and to have predicted the breakup of Pangaea, and all of these really large features. It's large features that are very hard to explain in either the biological or the physical sciences, and small ones that you can put in a bottle you can explain quite rigorously in both physics and biology. And it's really the physical scale of the system, which imparts huge limitations on your resources and on your ability to do work. So I don't want to say that evolutionary biology needs to be judged by a separate standard whatsoever. And this is precisely the problem that we're dealing with at the moment, because the area of evolutionary biology which is most problematic is called sexual selection, which is the theories that most people think of when they think of how the peacock's tail evolved. And these were the theories developed by Darwin for traits like the peacock's tail and the deer's antlers very late in his career.
And then the idea is that the females are selecting the males that get to mate with them, and they seem to be preferring these traits that otherwise would have no clear explanation, since they are a hindrance to the animal in its day-to-day life.
Right, and that theory is very problematic, and it's problematic not only because it's theoretically suspect, but because the data don't bear it out. And in my new book, The Genial Gene, for example, what I've gone through since 2004, which is when Evolution's Rainbow came out, I've gone through a dozen or so cases of what I call poster child species, in which really rigorous science has failed to confirm sexual selection type narratives, and I'm quoting from the authors of those studies. That's what they report, is the failure of sexual selection theory to work, including, of all things, for the peacock's tail. It turns out that the peacock's tail is not being, a large peacock's tail is not being favored by peahens. And it really requires some fresh thinking to understand how the peacock tail actually evolved. And
is there a good alternative theory out there?
Well, there are two for the peacock's tail in particular. The simplest from the group in Japan that is the one who summarized their own data along with others, is simply that in the peacock and in many other species, the female secondarily evolves to become more drab as a result of predation pressure. See, in these the gallinaceous birds, these ones on the ground, like chickens and so on, it's often the hen who's more exposed to predation than the male, than the rooster. And apparently the ancestors were very highly colored in both sexes. And so there's, instead of assuming that it's the male who evolved to get brighter and bigger, it's frequently the female who's evolved to get drabber and to avoid predation pressure. And the concomitant loss of the communication that being very colorful allows you to do. Because body color in animals is often body English, really. And so the drabber you are, the smaller your vocabulary in body English. Mm-hmm. And
okay.
So that's one reason. And then a reason that I've been suggesting as well is that these traits can be thought of as admission tickets to power-holding cliques. And we've got some theory, some modeling on this that we'll be submitting publication shortly. So there's a lot of possibilities, but people have to be open to the idea that sexual selection is not in good shape. And in my opinion, it's the only significant part of Darwin's work which is wrong. But we have to acknowledge that propositions in evolutionary biology need to be tested just like propositions in any science. We just can't cut them slack.
Well, let me give you an example from the realm of human nature and see of a theory that's kind of prevalent to explain something, and it's germane to relations between the sexes, and see what you think about its kind of epistemological status. In other words, how much credence we should give to it. It's about jealousy in humans. It grows largely out of the work of Martin Daly and Margot Wilson in Canada. And they kind of, in thinking about it, about male and female jealousy, they kind of reasoned that, in theory, men and women, to the extent that jealousy is an adaptation and serves a Darwinian function, it should, in theory, differ a little between the two sexes, because, of course, in a species with so-called high male parental investment, that is in our species, a lot of times the males do stick around, fall in love with the kids, help provide for them, and so on. If the female has actually been impregnated by another man, so that the father is investing in an offspring that is in fact not his, from a Darwinian point of view, that's kind of a disaster. That's a very bad use of time. So you would expect male jealousy to focus on sexual infidelity of females, they reasoned, and they reasoned that although females certainly wouldn't be happy about the sexual infidelity of a male mate, because that could have costs from the female's point of view as well. Those costs would not be as great as the costs of female infidelity to a male. On the other hand, a cost where the asymmetry might work in the other direction is that the females, I'm not sure if I put that exactly right, but anyway, the idea is that the female does have reason to worry. If the male is providing substantial investments, the female does have cause to, or it is very bad in Darwinian terms if the male deserts entirely. So you expect females to be very jealous of the affections of males, so that it would bother a female perhaps more than the male's sexual infidelity, the kind of emotional infidelity. In other words, falling in love with another woman. Now, they reasoned this, and then they went and they looked for the data, and they went back and pored over a lot of pre-existing data where the difference hadn't really been highlighted, but if you looked at the raw data, they did find this difference. And then in addition to that, a certain number of studies have been done, some of them cross-cultural, survey data. And I would say by and large, this expectation has been borne out. Now, empirically, you may differ there or something, but I'm curious. So the way I look at it is look, this is the best theory we have right now that explains an observed difference between male and female jealousy. So for the time being, at least, it's ahead, and in fact, it seems quite plausible to me. But what do you think of that theory?
Well, I haven't studied that theory, and I can't comment on it in detail. But as you related, what I would be concerned about is whether they actually put it to test, whether there was an alternative hypothesis that was on the table, and one which they could have confirmed instead of the one that they claimed to have confirmed. And the problem that we're frequently finding in the sort of in Darwinian rationalization of human behavior is the supposition that the assumption or that the hypothesis is true. And so the data are then mined in order to affect the appearance of a confirmation of the hypothesis. And this is a problem. And the other problem in the narrative you related is the focus on numbers, sort of on ownership of offspring and on paternity protection. And I've been trying to get people to focus less on mating, the mating aspect of reproduction, and more on the successful delivery of offspring into the next generation. And that's important not so much for humans, that I really don't feel qualified to comment on, but we've spent a lot of time in my lab looking into extra pair paternity, as it's called in birds, where birds will often raise eggs in their nest that have been parented either by the father or the mother from a nearby nest. And so if you look at the eggs within any given nest, frequently, I wouldn't say typically, but frequently, some of them were either laid from a female nearby, or some of them were sired from a male nearby. And this is always interpreted at the moment in terms of cheating of various sorts. And the explanation which is commonly discussed is that a female will solicit extra pair paternity when she's seeking a genetic upgrade, if she's unhappy with the genetic quality of her so-called pair mate or pair male. And the data, again, don't bear this out. And we've done and published a large meta-analysis of 150 studies or so of this, and it's not there. And we've wound up publishing, because of the failure to confirm this genetic upgrade type hypothesis and variants of it, we've proposed a different model, which is one in which there's actually offspring sharing between adjacent nests. And so we've looked at this in terms of side payments and cooperative transactions, in effect, between nests.
Cooperative transaction between the males, in a certain sense?
And between the females, and between the females. And as you can think about it, sort of very simply put, the question is whether you want all your eggs in one basket. And so it's quite possible, to show conditions under which it's advantageous to spread the eggs around. And everybody buys into this because they as individuals leave more offspring in the next generation by buying into a co-rearing situation. But of course, when there's co-rearing going on, from an economic point of view, it's better for pairs of birds to bring to work together in taking care of a bunch of eggs. And we know there's colonial breeding, so when there's a common nest shared by a bunch of birds, but there could also be simply a kind of more disarticulated communal breeding in which you have clusters of pairs. You have pairs of birds, but they are as pairs working on a collective of eggs, and come out ahead as individuals because of this. And this focus on paternity and paternity protection and paternity guarding and so on is forcing people to take their eye off the target of evolution and natural selection, which is how many offspring are produced and make it into the next generation. The bottom line is number of offspring. The bottom line is not mating. And
right.
And that's what gets
say,
lost
though,
in this field.
I think in the case of that jealousy example I gave you, though, they are taking into account successful delivery of offspring into the next generation, because the point is that the female, in wanting to keep the male around, I mean, they've long since quit mating, right? But I mean, for the purposes of this offspring, but the female wants to hang on to the investment that will increase the chances that the offspring will reach maturity. So,
right. Well, my interpretation of that, though, is that they would keep mating, but the mating isn't in connection with actually yielding a conception. That the mating in an awful lot of animals is really just a social exchange, and that's why, as you probably know, like in in these, there are a lot of birds in which the amount of matings has been measured, and you can get 100 matings per egg produced, which makes it look as if mating is very inefficient. And then there's also a lot of same-sex mating and same-sex sexuality going on, which obviously isn't leading directly to any offspring. And a lot of the mating that goes on is just pair bonding. It's just maintaining the sense of friendship, which is what's being used by a pair in order to cooperate in raising young together. And so I would focus, in the case of these Canadian workers, more on the implications for the loss of friendship that would be associated with cheating, if they do cheat, than I would focus on implications for loss of paternity. And also, sometimes there are there are more cases of parents raising children from other families, foster children, than one might acknowledge. So it's I would also want to inquire about the facts in this matter.
You mean knowingly rearing children who are not their own?
Yeah. There's obviously a lot of adoption that goes on.
I think you may underestimate the amount of attention evolutionary psychologists have paid to this issue. I mean, for example, that implicates the whole question of how the bonding takes place between parent and offspring, naturally. In other words, it's not like, when you have the explanation for intra-family altruism is, kin selection, and the idea is that, well, you love them and take care of them because they share your genes. Well, that doesn't mean the genes themselves magically sense the presence of copies of themselves in the offspring. Rather, it's that genes which, undergird a whole mechanism of recognizing who your kin are, and then, but not necessarily consciously recognizing them, but in other words, genes that undergird a mechanism for selectively bestowing affection and compassion and whatever on your offspring would survive. So, for example, it may be, we know that nursing releases oxytocin, right? Mm-hmm. And so a mother, and induces, I guess, for that reason, a kind of a sense of bliss or something approaching it in a mother. And so she looks down and gazes at the offspring and bonds with the offspring. So the idea is that is evolution's way of getting you to fall in love with, it's one of the mechanisms for getting a parent to fall in love with the offspring. And I believe, there is evidence that, so that would explain how you can switch the child. And in fact, there are these cases of accidentally switched children, right? In hospitals, they give the mother the wrong child. You will fall in love with the kid for sure. And that is, in that sense, it may seem to defy Darwinism because you're in love with a baby that has none of your genes. But it doesn't defy Darwinism when you understand the role that bonding mechanisms have to play in the realization of kin selection type logic. Now, I think you're right that certainly there are parents who are responsible parents of children that entered their life at a much later age, and that's an interesting question. I do kind of think the evidence probably shows that the earlier, I'm not sure of this, but I think the earlier the child, say a foster child, the younger the child is, the better off you are in that sense, and that may well be because there are some the bonding mechanisms that naturally bond a parent to an infant still have some time to kick in. But I think, believe me, evolutionary psychologists think about this stuff. I'm not sure they're as simple-minded as you may think.
Well, I don't mean to suggest that they're simple-minded. They're your words. I've never said that. And I do think, though, that a lot of, in a broad brush sense, a lot of evolutionary evolutionary psychology is mistaken, because I have said and have said in print that by and large evolutionary psychology uncritically accepts sexual selection theory, and that is my considered judgment on the matter.
Even there, I mean, do you wouldn't you agree that in a certain sense some sexual selection is very likely to be taking place, at least in the sense that there are some, although of course, look, different women like different things in a man, different men like different things in a woman, but still, there are some kinds of broad rules of thumb that seem sufficiently widespread among females that you can say, in some sense, this is a species-typical preference of females when they're selecting males, and so on. So too with males selecting females. Wouldn't you agree? There are at least some things that qualify for that term. Whether it's like in my experience, women do like other things being equal. They would like a physically robust man, and men would like a physically robust woman. You might mean different things by robust in the two cases, but certainly let's just stick with women, because this is not something I'm necessarily happy about. But women do seem to like big, strong, athletic men. It isn't what they wind up choosing in every case, but I think you can call it a fairly typical preference. And in any event, if it's even a majority preference, wouldn't you agree that has to wind up influencing the kinds of male genes that get into the next generation, to the extent that choice is exerted? Well,
I don't know where to begin. I don't agree, by and large, with the point of view you're advocating. There are many serious problems with sexual selection theory, and I think I'd advise how to put this exactly, but I sense your enthusiasm for this, and I know this is widespread among evolutionary psychologists, and I also want to say for the record that I hope evolutionary psychology succeeds. We need it. It's a valuable subject, and but I suggest it won't succeed as a discipline until it adopts a more critical stance vis-a-vis sexual selection. And I don't think that it's okay to talk about females as selecting for males in the way you were doing, especially because of the problem called the paradox of the Lek. And it's and simply put, it's that
is that L-E-K, you mean?
Yeah, L-E-K. Paradox of the Lek.
We should probably tell people what that means.
And a Lek is a group of males which are hanging out together and trying to attract a female. But the paradox of the Lek, which doesn't really have all that much to do with Leks per se, is that if females are continually selecting males for certain traits, like robustness, to use your example, then after a few generations of this, say 20 generations, all the males should have the traits that are being selected for. And this rapid erosion under female choice of the hierarchy of genetic quality that's supposed to exist in males is a problem that geneticists keep trying to solve. And behavioral ecologists and evolutionist ecologists tend not to be even aware of the problem. But there's a large literature of a dozen or so papers now in population genetics which concoct different mechanisms to regenerate the bad genes, the genes in your example for non-robustness, which the females are supposed to be continually weeding out. And the maintenance of the bad genes that female choice is supposed to be weeding out all the time is a serious problem in the theoretical narrative of sexual selection. And it leads to the paradox of the lek. And other times when you hear stories about selection for animals of certain traits, like there's discussion of selection for females so that they have certain traits, and I recently cited some stuff about selection for people to be cooperative and empathetic, which would lead to the paradox of what I call the paradox of the saint. Whereas if people were being selected to be all empathetic, then everyone would be empathetic after 20 generations. And if males were selecting females to have a certain trait, then they would all have that trait after several generations, which I've called the paradox of the creche. This keeps recurring, and you always need to keep regenerating the bad genes that to explain why the selection, even the preference, continues.
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, there are explanations, and evolutionary psychologists kind of grapple with this and are aware of it, that can explain the preservation of diversity within a population, such as frequency-dependent selection and so on. But there's also just the fact that kind of, if you measure things at a sufficiently fine-grained level, you will always find diversity, right? In other words, like with empathy, you're saying, well, why isn't everybody really empathetic? Well, you would agree, I assume, that every human being who's normal has empathy, and they do deploy it sometimes, right? So it is a species-typical trait to have empathy and deploy it at least sometimes, and that's something, right? I mean, and in the case of empathy, there's is a very complex subject as to why people would deploy it in different ways. And I think one point you make, which is certainly true, is that in a lot of these cases, the pattern of deployment and the extent of your empathy is going to be shaped by developmental experiences, for example. Although in theory, the algorithm governing the development may well have a Darwinian explanation, and evolution. We think about that kind of stuff too. But you kind of, and in the case of the robustness of males, you're right. Males are very different in their physiques. It's also true, on the other hand, that there's a very clear and substantial difference between the size of the average male and the size of the average female. And maybe I'm asking you too many things, but one question that arose as you were talking was, do you have your own preferred explanation for what is known as sexual dimorphism? That is to say, there is a pronounced difference in the average size of males and females?
Yes, but the problem is also to understand why there is sexual monomorphism, because sexual selection sort of is all about explaining why there is dimorphism, but as we all know, there are a huge number of species in which there isn't any dimorphism, not the least of which are, guinea pigs that people have, that you have to, take them and look closely in order to tell them apart. Interesting cases of monomorphic species are the penguins, and
Sure, but if you look just within primates, evolutionary psychologists have pointed to a pattern that is suggestive, which is to say, the greater, you might say, the more polygynous the species within primates. You compare gibbons, which have a lot of very little sexual dimorphism and are relatively monogamous, to gorillas, which have a lot of dimorphism and are quite polygynous. And the point is that there is a pattern here, which is that the greater the variance in reproductive success among males, the more sexual dimorphism there is. Now that certainly seems to me quite consistent with an emphasis on sexual selection, although it may not be the answer. But again, I would say, evolutionary psychologists, they're quite aware of the variation in species, and they often use that and try to correlate it with other variables, as in this case, to test claims about the evolutionary origins of human nature.
Well, I don't know what you're asking me. I don't want to conduct, a detailed critique of evolutionary psychology on the fly like this. What are you asking me exactly?
Well, why is it that the correlation I just described between sexual dimorphism and degree of polygyny within primates, why is that not evidence in favor of a sexual selection type of explanation? Why does that not seem to be? Actually, there's two different scenarios you could throw in. One is, but certainly one is female choice. There's another one I have in mind that we don't have time to get into. But I guess you haven't thought about that. But so there's no point in asking you to interpret it. But
I have thought about the evolution of dimorphism and monomorphism, but I see them as coupled problems. I'm serious about that. And our understanding, the model that we have for the evolution of dimorphism has to do with the finding the ecological circumstances in which it's advantageous for males to form power-holding cliques. And when there are power-holding cliques that are economically advantageous, then that sets up a selection pressure for admission tickets to get into them. And so the admission tickets are then the source of the ornaments and of any other aspects of the dimorphism. But our interpretation of it as well is that it's not limited to males. So the spotted hyenas are very interesting, as you may know, in that the females have penises, and these are a kind of ornament, and these would appear to also be used by females as admission tickets to female power-holding cliques. On the other hand, you get local ecologies of the sort that the penguins are living in which we hypothesize that it's not economically advantageous to have power-holding cliques there, that they're foraging at will or at random, if you will, out in the sea looking for fish. There's nothing to defend. There's no advantage to being in a clique. They're not capturing fish that require more than one animal to cooperate in bringing it down. So our interpretation of the evolution of sexual dimorphism traces to the local ecological conditions under which it's advantageous to have cliques and therefore admission tickets. And the kind of example that you're going into where you say, look here, let's look only at the primates and let's look at their mating systems, and don't we have a pattern? The problem with that is that you haven't got an alternative hypothesis on the table that could also explain the pattern. There hasn't been the kind of intellectual effort into conjuring up reasonable alternative hypotheses. And it can't be science until you actually put an alternative hypothesis up against it. It's not enough to build a pattern, to mine for a pattern, and then to say, well, this is consistent with sexual selection, so therefore sexual selection has to have something going for it. It remains to be seen whether or not sexual selection has anything going for it.
Yeah,
and
I actually wouldn't claim that the correlation I cited is clear evidence of sexual selection as opposed to other explanations. I've never really. I haven't thought it through. I'm very aware of the correlation. I think it's very significant. And I do think sexual selection is the best explanation. Is the explanation that most naturally springs to mind. But the thing you said about the coalitional thing is interesting because you didn't use the term coalition. Power sharing cliques. It seems kind of applicable to a species like, say, chimpanzees, which have these coalitions of males. So that's interesting. I would say I think evolutionary psychologists, there may be more disagreement among them than you realize. There's a lot of disagreement among them, but I think you're right. I mean, my understanding of the way science works is it's not that the individual scientist has a theory and says, okay, this is what I think may be the case, but first I should consider all the alternative explanations. It's more of a social process where one person is wed to a particular theory and they put it out there and defend it with all their life, and then through a process of kind of intellectual competition, other scientists, like you in this case, say, no, wait, maybe this is the explanation. And I think that's how the progress actually happens. I mean, I don't know that you can fault an individual scientist for not having thought of all the alternatives to his or her theory. I think that tends to be something that happens socially more than individually.
Right, and I'm not criticizing individual scientists, and also didn't for that matter in the Genial gene. But on the other hand, I am criticizing the peer group of evolutionary psychologists for, as I said before, their uncritical acceptance of sexual selection theory. And I think that, as I said before, we need evolutionary psychology to be successful. We really need that. Certainly we biologists are in favor of having an evolutionary psychology. We don't think a whole lot, I dare say, of Freud and Freudian interpretations. And it's got to be better someday, sometime, to have an evolutionarily based theory of human behavior. But you got to get it right. And there's just a huge amount of criticism from biologists of evolutionary psychology, to which evolutionary psychologists turn a deaf ear. And it's a parenthetical subject from the standpoint of the theory that I've been introducing, which is about plants and animals and the origin of sexual reproduction in the first place, and the universality of sexual conflict. And the absence, in particular, of the universality of sexual conflict, which is what my point is. And you should actually be you should actually have an argument with who was among the Templeton essayists is probably Jeffrey Miller, who last time I checked was emphasizing sexual selection. Yes, I have disagreed with him quite considerably.
So in that sense, I was a poor choice for you. But anyway,
well, you chose me.
I was not an adequate foil. I was, but maybe down the road, if you both have time, that would be an interesting conversation.
Yes.
So it's been fun. The hour's gone by pretty fast. There were a lot of stuff I didn't ask you that I wanted to ask you. Oh, let me just ask you a quick question. You can answer it, and I'll say, I promise to say nothing in response. But you just, at the end of your essay, you said, I believe that investigating how evolution occurs is a sacred calling.
Uh-huh.
Just tell us what you mean by that, and then we'll end on that.
Well, it is. It's a precious calling. I don't want to get religious, and I suppose using the word sacred suggests a kind of religiousness. But, and as you must know, a lot of people who are deists think that in the study of nature, one is studying the signature, if you will, of God's work. I'm comfortable with that, but I don't, say things like that. It's not my. People's spirituality is a very personal matter, and I don't comment on and interact with others on that. I have been active in speaking in places of worship, trying to explain how evolution is consistent with religious beliefs, and hoping to help people be comfortable with evolution if they happen to identify as people of faith. And I think that we need to talk about evolution and the discovery of nature in terms that aren't hostile and antagonistic to people who are people of faith, because almost everyone I know who is a person of faith became that way not for intellectual reasons but for emotional reasons, and are not about to stop being people of faith if one points out the logical inconsistencies of the position, or if one even tries to address it through logic and evidence, because this is essentially an emotional position, and so I think that's why I try to talk about evolution as something that, in the study of evolution, as something that someone can pursue with a clear conscience. I've often spoken, for example, in fact, I remember speaking, I think it was in Iowa somewhere. I went out with a bunch of graduate students, and I have a small book out called Evolution and Christian Faith that came out in between Evolution's Rainbow and this most recent one, the Genial Gene. And if you get together with a group of around 10 grad students, you always find about 2 or 3 who hesitate to go home for the Thanksgiving holidays because they know they're going to be accosted by their relatives who will tell them that in studying evolution, they're studying the work of the devil. And and these will be graduate students in biology. And so people need to know that, first of all, they're not doing the work of the devil in any sense, and that they're not, and they need to be in a position to explain to their relatives, if the relatives are interested in discussion, how their activity is consistent with, and to people who are, and to biologists who are people of faith, would be viewed not only as consistent with their faith, but actually as implementing or carrying out their faith. I've spoken with artists who talk about their art, especially people painting icons, and an icon painter will describe painting an icon as a form of prayer. That in drawing the icon, it's their form of prayer. And to a scientist who's a scientist of faith, then studying nature would also be a form of prayer, including studying evolution. And there's no need to make enemies, as we seem to be doing so often in our country, of people of faith, since that's a huge majority of people. And we need educated people. We need people of faith who are educated and who are comfortable with the facts of nature as we now understand them. So that may be more than you want to hear.
No, that's very interesting, and I think I can infer, without you having to comment on this, that you probably don't think that all of Richard Dawkins' writings about religion have made it easier for Darwinian thought to make it to be warmly welcomed in all of the public schools in America and all corners of American society. And I think you may be right if I'm correct in that inference. In any event,
I had a discussion with him at one of these Beyond Belief meetings down at the Salk Institute, and that's on the web, and a lot of people have been looking at that. And even though he came on very strong and was very hostile to begin with, I think we did get to quite a large agreement at the end. Now he wants to diminish, if you will, my point by saying it's mere politics, and that reference to passages in the Bible that foreshadow evolutionary thought is, quote, bad poetry, as he put it. So he's really, goes after me with all guns blazing. But on the other hand, I mean, there we are. He is willing to concede that it's at least good politically, and he's willing to concede that there are passages in the Bible that do foreshadow a lot of evolutionary ideas, including natural selection and including the notion of randomness. And so it's therefore gratuitous to diminish those observations, because we have to reach people, we have to teach in a real society, outdoors, and you're not a successful educator if you're not talking to people as people, looking them in the eye and talking with them where they're at. And just to dismiss that as politics is not helpful. And so I think, but Richard is sincere, and I give him that. I just have a lot of affection for the guy, I really do. And so life goes on. Let's take it from here.
That we can agree on. Life, for the time being, will go on. And I wish this conversation could go on because we've opened up a set of issues that I could spend another hour on. But we're already close to setting a record for longest dialogue ever. So
sorry.
No. It was my job to call a halt to these things, but I found it hard to. So maybe we can continue this another time, or you and somebody else can. Okay. Jeffrey Miller, Richard Dawkins, somebody like that. So, but anyway, thanks a lot, Joan. This was a lot of fun.
Okay, great. Wonderful to meet you.
Same here.
Okay,
bye-bye.
Bye-bye.